Hello. One of the questions I get asked most often is also one that I don't particularly enjoy answering, which is, what is your favorite or your recommended mastering limiter? And the reason I don't really like answering it is I don't think it's really that helpful. I don't like to obsess over the differences between different types of limiters, partly because personally I don't use limiting that aggressively when I'm mastering, but also because back in the day, the choice of mastering limiter was very important. There were very few options, they were very expensive, and it would make a big difference to the results of your work. These days, there are many different options, excellent options at all kinds of different price points. So providing you don't want to be super aggressive, you're almost guaranteed to be able to find something that will enable you to get a great result. And that is my kind of preference of the way that I like to work and my recommendation for you. There are plugins that have really nice interfaces. There are some that make some kinds of tasks easier than others or that are quicker to use. But really, it comes down to a matter of personal preference. And there's another factor as well that I'll talk about later in this video. Having said all of that, recently I came across an example where my go-to limiter at the time didn't get me a clean result that I was happy with. And that prompted me to do some testing, and that gave me some quite interesting results. And I thought that you might be interested to take a listen to them as well. I think there are some useful things to learn about the way that different limiters work and how they interact with the source material. So it's not going to be an exhaustive shootout of mastering limiters. I'm going to show you some of the limiters that I like to use, and also I'm going to take a look at the new FG-X 2 limiter, which came out recently because people had been asking me about that. So let's get started. Here's the example I want to show you. It's called Beat 1v3. It was submitted by Sebastian, one of my members, and I think it was actually put together by his son. But here is my mastered version. So you can hear it's big, it's bassy, it's mellow, it's not super loud. That section is coming in at about -13 LUFS overall. But this is the mastered version where I was using a different limiter than the one that I normally use. If I switch over and use what was my default limiter at the time, which was the FabFilter Pro L2, I think you'll be able to hear the issue that I was having. Did you notice it? I'll play it to you again. So there is distortion on most of it, fairly subtly, but in particular, this kick drum and bass note here. Let me play that to you one more time. You can hear it's clipping distortion. It's clicky, it's fuzzy. In fact, just for comparison, let me just disable the limiter and play you how that would sound with pure clipping distortion. And now if I re-enable the Pro L. Now you might think that's not the end of the world, and depending on the material that might be the case. Personally, I'm not a big fan of clipping distortion, especially not on something like this. The unusual thing was that it surprised me because I wouldn't normally expect to hear it with the Pro L. And as I say, this clip is not extremely loud by any means. In fact, some people would say that it's not loud enough in this genre. So I did some experimentation. The limiter style that I was using at this point was punchy, and it turned out that the only two settings that were clean using the Pro L were the bus and safe settings. If I play you the bus version, this is not completely clean, but it's a lot cleaner. And that was almost it, but at the time I had just installed and was testing the TC Electronic ND4 mastering plugin package. which you may have come across. It's a plugin version of the algorithms that used to be used in their System 6000 unit, which cost tens of thousands of dollars. I used it for the best part of a decade earlier on in my career. It was an amazing piece of hardware with incredible converters and a beautiful, very unusual at that time, touch screen with faders to control some of the parameters. And now you can get the same algorithms in a plugin that only costs a few $100s. So as I mentioned, I had been experimenting with this in the early stages, and I thought, well, okay, let's just try it with the limiter. So I've disabled the EQ and multiband compression aspects of this. So you can see I just have the default universal limiter setting with the output threshold set at -1 dB true peak. And that was the version that I played you the first time. So here it is. Now, of course, none of this processing is entirely transparent, but we don't have the clipping distortion there that I noticed with the Pro L. I'll just play that to you one more time so you can hear yourself. And by the way, if you're finding that clipping distortion tricky to hear, you might want to try reducing your monitor gain temporarily. We can be distracted from it by high levels of bass sometimes, and reducing the gain can make it easier to hear. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about clipping so much in a video that's about limiting, it's because modern limiters almost all use clipping to some degree in order to achieve their results. Clipping can be a very effective way of shaving off the transients of very short sounds. The issue is, as we're hearing, when it's applied to more sustained sounds like the boom of the kick and the bass in this example, it can become quite audible. So, for example, the TC limiter here has a soft clipping parameter that we can dial in, but by default it's off. So as far as I'm aware, we're hearing pure limiting in that case, whereas the Fab filter includes a variety of different settings, some of which involve different degrees of clipping in the way that they process the sound. So the final example I wanted to play you was a comparison between the original Slate FG-X and the new FG-X2. I was never that much of a fan of the FG-X because it was purely an intelligent clipping processor. It didn't, so far as I'm aware, involve any kind of actual limiting, and I wasn't a big fan of the results. So here is the FG-X version. And to me, that sounds almost as messy as pure clipping distortion. Let's just compare. If we turn Fab filter off temporarily. That was clipping. This is Slate. There's very little difference there. And it's not that I think that clipping isn't a useful tool sometimes. I combine it myself deliberately with limiting when I want to get a harder hitting result sometimes. The problem with limiting can be that because it is controlling the peak overshoot cleanly, the artifact that you get from that can be a softening of the transients or even pumping effect. Sometimes that's not what we're looking for musically. So to blend in a combination of clipping and limiting can feel better sometimes. But with the FG-X, I almost always felt that I was hearing more distortion than I wanted, especially if I tried to push the level higher. And I'm sure it's possible to get better results with it by tweaking the settings. I was just never inspired to put in the work to achieve that myself. Now, as a comparison, here is the new Slate FG-X2. All of these plugins, by the way, have their default settings, apart from dialing in a maximum output ceiling of -1, and we have the default setting of clear here. So let's just see how that sounds. And that one is nice and clean. Having said that, I feel like I'm hearing more pumping on there than I did with the TC. Let's flick back and compare that. It's a subtle difference, but it's there. And actually, what I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm actually going to, on all of these clips, add in an extra 3 dB of gain reduction to make it easier for you to hear the differences between them. So if I just come through and enable that here, let's see what effect that has. So here is the original FabFilter Pro L. In fact, let's just double check which setting did I have on the Pro L there. Let's try safe, which is should be the cleanest. And again, we're hearing more ducking in the sound there when you can hear the limiter controlling that initial transient on the kick drum and relaxing. In comparison to the TC, in comparison to the FG-X original, really extreme distortion you can hear there. And that's, like I say, the issue that I have with it. And then FG-X2 with this extra 3 dB of gain. And I think you'll agree, with those clean settings and the clipping taken out of the equation, the differences between them are actually getting quite subtle at this point. So, other than to show you that there is a difference between different types of limiters, why am I showing you all of this? I think the first thing is a word of caution. If we just go back to the original Pro L version, if I disable that gain reduction again and we just take a look at what the plugin is doing, let's put it back on, I was using the punchy setting. So we've got 3.7 dB of gain reduction happening on that kick drum. That is a lot of gain reduction, but as I say, this is not making the tune extremely loud. We've got minus 12 LUFS on this section here. So it's an example that with some types of material, I mean, bear in mind, this was a limiter that I've been using fairly regularly at that time and was generally very happy with. But on this particular song, it wasn't giving me a result that I liked. And that would be even more the case if I was using the FG-X, for example. I also wanted to give you the chance to just hear the different ways that those limiters handled the material. And of course, I should say this is a slightly unfair test because I'm using exactly the same settings. I set up this example using the TC limiter so that it sounded good to me, and then I'm just swapping out other limiters. I would always recommend that you master with the limiter in place so that you can hear the effect that it's happening on the sound, and you can tune the settings of the limiter and any processing you have going into that limiter to achieve a result that you're happy with. I think it's important to be aware of the distinction between limiting and clipping and the fact that clipping is being used in modern limiters so that you can listen out for it. At the end of the day, we're trying to control peaks that would otherwise go above zero and hard clip. There are only so many ways of achieving that. No matter how smart the processing is, at the end of the day, roughly speaking, you're just balancing pumping with distortion. And maybe I can demonstrate that effectively using the TC limiter here. As I mentioned, by default, the soft clipping for that is off. So I'll play you how that sounds with no clipping. And I'll turn off the gain boost for the time being. So we're just hearing my original mastering choices. If we bring down the soft clipping to perhaps -1, so now when the signal hits -1, you're going to hear that soft clipping effect start, which is reducing the amount of limiting that's going to take place. That still sounds fairly clean, but let's take it down much further. Now you start to hear that clipping quality, that crunch coming into it. I think I still probably prefer that to the original Pro L settings. Let's just check those are, yeah. That's much more clicky and edgy to me. Maybe there's not so much in it when you do the comparison at that level, but you can hear pure limiting on the TC gives us some pumping, which I don't mind. I'm quite happy with the sound of that. I think it does it quite cleanly and well. Whereas to get control of the same effects in the Pro L, we need to switch between these different styles here, and only the bus or safe styles with these default settings was giving me a clean result there. And you don't have that option at all with the original FG-X, which I think is something else that it's important to be aware of. Lots of people use this and really like it, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't either, but I think it's helpful to understand how it works and what the downsides could be. And then finally, if we look at the FG-X2, I'll just show you how that sounds with these different settings here. So this is the clear setting. If we switch that up to tight, you can hear there's a little bit of distortion creeping in there. We go to the punchy. That's quite a lot of distortion now. And then loud. That's really quite aggressive again. Let's compare that with the original FG-X. I think I had, let me check. Yeah, so these both have the extra gain setting, so I'm running them quite hot. Maybe that's slightly unfair. Let's go back to without the gain setting. So here's the FG-X. That's still distorting. And how about FG-X2? That's also distorting. So for me, with this musical example, on the loud setting there with the FG-X2, we're getting a similar degree of clipping type distortion as we did with the original FG-X. But the good thing is we have the option, and the default is this new clear setting, which you can see there says maximum transparency. I do think, though, it's important for us to pay attention to the language that's being used. I've heard lots of people say that the original FG-X was transparent. And to me, it doesn't sound that way at all because of the clipping distortion that it introduces. What I would say is that it has no pumping. So it is transparent in that sense. If you hear a traditional limiter and hear the control of the dynamics that keep it clean, but do soften those transients and when you push it harder, cause pumping in the sound, lots of people are going to say that's not transparent. And I would agree. The question is, what is the right balance? And for me, pure clipping is rarely transparent enough for my taste. And I think one other point to make is, I'm sure there will be some people watching this saying, well, this is an unrealistic example, because what we have here, the reason this is such a challenge for these limiters is that you have a combined kick drum hit and bass line, both of which have a lot of deep bass, and there's no high frequency content or very little high frequency content in there to mask the artifacts that we're hearing. It might be a better approach to use some sidechain compression in the original mix so that when the kick hits, the bass tone is pulled very rapidly out and then releases back into the signal so that the bass sound gets out of the way of the kick drum and leaves enough space for the kick to really hit. That would reduce the demands on the limiter. That's a fair point, and I'm not saying that wouldn't be a good thing to do with this mix, but I also feel, since I'm not mastering this at extreme loudness at all, it's not unrealistic to expect these processors to be able to get a clean result with this material. I feel, that's what I expected. That's why I was surprised when I heard the distortion with the Pro L originally, and why I kind of went down this little rabbit hole of listening to all of this stuff. So if I'm going to wrap this up, I think the takeaways from this video are just to be aware that even some of the most highly regarded processing, limiting available is not necessarily going to work for all the material that you throw at it. It gets more challenging for all of them when you are working at higher loudness. And I think an important point for me to make is that, in my opinion, pure limiting alone is not an effective way to achieve that. I prefer to use a blend of compression and limiting. But at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you want to control the dynamics using limiting, it's essentially a trade-off between pumping or clipping, and it's up to us to find the right balance. This was one of the first times I had tested out the MD4, and since then I've used it a lot more, and I really like it. Maybe that's because it's so similar to the processing that I used all those years in the System 6000. But for me, I prefer the fact that it defaults to a clean sound and that I can dial in more aggression, more clipping if I choose to, depending on the material. and I've been using it more and more regularly ever since. Having said that, we can also get good results with the other examples that we're using here, the Pro L and the new FG-X2, and both of those also give us the flexibility to dial in a more aggressive clipping sound if we want it. So at the end of the day, this is just another choice that we have to make. As always, there's certainly a degree of taste involved and preference as to which one you think works best for you. So there you go. I hope that was helpful or interesting. After all of the testing and the comments, I do come back to my original position, which is I don't think it's really valuable for us to spend ages obsessing about which mastering limiter we're going to use. There are differences between them, especially depending on the material and especially at high loudness levels. But if you're prepared to dig into the settings and spend some time optimizing things, I think it is possible to get a great result with a really wide range of the options that are available to us these days. Personally, I don't think pure limiting is an effective way to achieve high loudness levels. I prefer to use a mixture of compression and limiting so that we can share the load between the two processes to get a more natural and invisible result, which is my goal when I'm mastering. And whatever you decide to do, I recommend that you have the limiter there while you're mastering, that you master into the limiter that you've chosen so that you're hearing any artifacts that there might be and you're taking those into account while you're choosing the processing that's hitting that limiter to get the best possible result. So at the end of the day, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. If you found this useful or interesting, then I'm sure you would also love a free PDF that I've put together. It's called the Home Mastering Guide, and it takes you through what I consider to be the 6 essential steps to achieving great results that you can be confident of when you want to release your music. It's completely free, and you can get your copy at homemasteringguide.com. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.